Urgent. Orbán has never experienced such disgrace before. The countdown has begun. The Hungarian Prime Minister is already packing his bags. Washington has publicly abandoned Putin's favorite. The White House has officially chosen a new leader. Sensational. Ukraine's lethal weapon is on the front line. A drone swarm trapped Putin's army. Even Akhmat hysterically admits Ukraine is stronger than NATO. Our people did it. Such a triumph has shocked everyone in the Kremlin. Shock! An offensive from Transnistria. Putin in agony is playing his last trump card, but the Ukrainian armed forces are ready. A special operation that will ruin all of Moscow's plans. As the Kremlin tries to spark a new front, our defenders have a response that will shake the Kremlin walls. More on our program Hotspot. Urgent, the secret is out. Orbán has signed Hungary's sentence. The White House is officially letting go of Viktor Orbán's hand. Washington is no longer betting on the Kremlin's lame horse and is openly siding with the opposition. The final chord in the Hungarian Prime Minister's career. Orbán has been publicly trampled. 30 games before the elections have turned into a catastrophe. Watch for all the details.
Vance arrived to save Orbán 5 days before the parliamentary elections in Hungary. The Vice President of the United States flew into the country to support the incumbent Prime Minister. Vance became the first American Vice President to visit Hungary in the past 35 years.
Vance is essentially playing the role of Orbán's VIP campaigner before the elections, and he is supposed to help mobilize Orbán's electorate with the message that the United States is on Orbán's side. Support Orbán and you'll have friendly relations with the United States.
The Vice President of the United States did not hold back on compliments. He highly praised Orbán's leadership and called him the person who has done more than any other leader in Europe to successfully resolve the war between Russia and Ukraine. At the same time, Vance criticized the European Union, claiming that Brussels was allegedly interfering in the parliamentary elections.
They see Orbán as a destructive force within the European Union, who, if not able to break up the EU from within, will at least significantly weaken it. And this will allow the United States to dictate its will to the European Union in terms of tariffs and economic cooperation. And overall, this is Trump's ideal, which he has repeatedly stated, that the European Union should be destroyed. The European Union is supposedly a hostile organization for the United States, and therefore it should be destroyed. Orbán is helping. This is, in fact, one of his main slogans, that he will oppose Brussels. So I think this is the main reason why Orbán is so fiercely loved by the Trump administration.
He also accused part of the Ukrainian intelligence services of trying to influence the elections in the US and Hungary.
As we can see, in general, the disease is progressing, and it has already spread from Donald Trump to his vice president. Everywhere they try to find some kind of witches, people to blame for interfering in the American and European elections. But in fact, so far, the only proven interference in those elections where Trump defeated Hillary Clinton was by the Russians. So, well, probably the guilty one always gives himself away.
On April 12th, Hungary will elect a new parliament. These elections are critically important for the stability of the EU and the future of relations with Ukraine. Viktor Orbán, whose premiership has lasted 16 years and is known for its pro-Russian stance, has essentially staked his entire political future. Orbán is running an aggressive media campaign that is overflowing with disinformation. The main focus is to convince Hungarians not to support the rest of Europe in helping Ukraine. On the Fidesz party's campaign posters are the faces of Volodymyr Zelensky and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who are allegedly dragging Hungary into war.
This is the hallmark of Russian intelligence services. They very often try to use the language of intimidation in electoral rhetoric. Orbán, in trying to demonize both Zelensky and European leaders, attempted to create an atmosphere of general fear and threat for Hungary and to present himself as a kind of savior. But as we can see, Orbán still fails to fool the majority of his country's population. And all of this is clearly reflected in the ratings, which are constantly declining.
Viktor Orbán is the most pro-Russian leader among the EU and NATO members. While most Western countries are trying to isolate themselves from the aggressor, Orbán continues to build ties. According to Bloomberg, the Prime Minister of Hungary offered the Russian dictator Putin help in resolving the war in Ukraine and assured him of friendship. Politico writes that in December, Hungary and Russia also signed a secret 12-point agreement aimed at strengthening ties ahead of Orbán's elections.
Orbán loves money very much, and Russia is practically an unlimited source, at least from the perspective of a country like Hungary, of corrupt income, and this corrupt income will go directly into Orbán's own pocket, not, for example, into the Hungarian budget.
It turns out that the pro-Russian Prime Minister of Hungary in the 1990s was connected to the Russian mafia and received funding from them. Large sums of cash were handed over to Orbán for his political campaign, reports The Insider. But now Russian money is no longer helping Orbán. The era of his rule is under threat. His party Fidesz is losing to the opposition party KISE.
Orbán behaves, and not only behaves, but essentially is, an authoritarian ruler who doesn't care about legality, who basically does not follow any democratic traditions. That's why it's obvious that falsifications, administrative resources, and attempts to use foreign intelligence services, primarily Russian ones, all these tools are good for Orbán, and he will do everything he can to cling to power.
A change in the ruling party would mean not only a new prime minister, but also a shift in Hungary's foreign policy direction.
You shouldn't expect too much from the Magyar since he is still the leader of Hungary. That is, in fact, Ukraine doesn't need much from Hungary.
Ukraine does not expect Hungary to suddenly become a pro-Ukrainian country. For Ukraine, it is enough if Hungary simply is not an anti-Ukrainian country, does not block all Ukrainian decisions in the European Union, does not interfere, and does not engage in sabotage. And I think that in this regard, it would be possible to come to an agreement with any Hungarian government that is not led by Orbán.
Earlier, Western media reported that Orbán might declare a state of emergency and attempt to postpone the elections or challenge their results, which could lead to a political crisis.
This is the end of Russian defense. The Ukrainian armed forces have used the weapons of the future. A true technological hell has begun for the occupiers on the front line. Ukraine has officially deployed a new generation of deadly drones in combat, which have shocked even elite Chechen units. A loud hysteria in Grozny. Details in the report.
Ukrainian manufacturers have managed to achieve a breakthrough in the field of drones. Ukrainian manufacturers are still keeping any information about the new drones secret, but in Russia, complaints have already begun that fighting against the Ukrainian armed forces has become even more difficult. For example, the commander of Akhmat, Apti Alaudinov, he has never spoken about allegedly downed drones with such a sour expression before.
It should be noted that the situation has changed specifically in terms of unmanned systems. The enemy has acquired new model drones. Just recently, the guys shot down several drones of this category. Well, we've already studied them in the lab, looked at what they are, and it turns out these drones seem to be joint productions between Ukraine and Germany, or Ukraine and France, modernized drones like that.
Drones complicate both the occupiers' logistics and their lives, and this is what Alaudinov is talking about. Martian drone. The drones operate day and night. You only hear them in the last seconds during their dive, like in the video. They can't be detected by conventional sensors and are protected against electronic warfare. Moreover, as the Russians themselves write, the build quality is very high. And there is a version that the drones already have artificial intelligence. Alaudinov assures everyone that he already knows the entire technology behind these drones. But our experts do not agree with this.
At the tactical level, there are a number of solutions that allow bypassing Russian electronic warfare, including, for example, frequencies, the use of fiber optic cables, and so on. It is important to note that Apti Alaudinov himself is certainly not a specialist in the field of radio engineering. He is essentially just a prominent talking head representing the Akhmat unit. And he really serves no other significant purpose beyond that role.
That's exactly why Apti doesn't say much about these drones. He simply acknowledges the fact with a sad face, the drones exist and they are dangerous. Moreover, Russian soldiers have started to complain that the Ukrainian armed forces have begun striking with drones carrying graphite bombs. No, these are not nuclear drones. The point of this kind of weapon is that it disables equipment and electronics without physically destroying them, without demolishing the surrounding buildings.
So, as a means of damage, even without a precision strike on a specific target, if this graphite dust settles on wires or any other components, it already negatively affects transmission levels and causes corresponding malfunctions. If we're talking about an air defense system, a surface-to-air missile complex, and such ammunition falls on it, yes, it may not destroy the complex, of course, but given its contents, it can completely cut it off from any communications and even short-circuit its internal connections.
Ukraine is making progress in technology, and there seems to be no end to this progressiveness, which is very encouraging. Moreover, as stated by the Ukrainian company General Chereshnya, a large underground factory will be built in Ukraine to produce drone components together with the Croatian company ORBAN'S, which is the largest manufacturer of drones and components in the world. The goal is complete independence from Chinese components. Yes, while Russia is increasing its dependence, Ukraine is strengthening its own capabilities. At the moment, Ukraine is ramping up the production and modernization of drones, and moreover is even exporting them. Ukrainian drone manufacturing companies are among the top 100 in the world. And it seems that the demilitarization Putin so desperately wanted has failed spectacularly, just like the plan to capture Kyiv in 2 or 3 days.
By the year 2026, Ukraine has undoubtedly become the leading nation in the world today across a wide variety of advanced drone systems. These systems are being utilized at both the tactical and strategic levels for effectively striking the enemy. For this reason, we have a great deal of valuable expertise and practical knowledge to share with our many global partners working in this rapidly evolving area.
The war has long since changed, becoming more technological. And now the Russians' tactic of taking tree lines with human wave assaults is no longer working. At the same time, Russian war correspondents are no longer confident that they can win at all.
Now, it's not NATO training Ukrainian soldiers, but the Ukrainian army itself. It's a bitter conclusion, but we'll have to accept it as it is. The Ukrainian army, Ukrainian soldiers are teaching NATO how this very war should be fought. This is already an open secret. If some time ago we talked about training grounds somewhere in Bavaria or Saxony where Ukrainian soldiers were being trained, now it all looks different. Now NATO soldiers are being trained at these same training grounds. In fact,
well, I'm going to speak bluntly, but what I see and what I feel, I know many won't like it, but I'll say it. It turns out the Ukrainian army is stronger than the NATO army.
The so-called second army in the world can no longer cope with the ambitions of the old dictator Putin, and it's time to accept that.
An explosion in Transnistria. Putin is opening a second front. The dictator has officially played his last trump card, trying to set Moldova on fire. The rebel and dictator is throwing fire, hoping to drag Chisinau into a bloody massacre, but he did not expect such a turn of events. Ukraine and Moldova have become a single fist. How will they respond to Moscow? Watch.
The Kremlin is planning to create a buffer zone in the Vinnytsia region from the direction of Transnistria. This statement was made in a recent interview by the deputy head of the president's office, Pavel Palisa. The brigadier general spoke about the plans for the Russian spring-summer campaign, among which, for the first time, the occupiers are considering creating a buffer zone in the Vinnytsia region.
The Russians have even included a point in their plans about creating a buffer zone in the Vinnytsia region from the side of the unrecognized Transnistria. This is the first time they have documented plans of this nature. Pavel Palisa, Brigadier General of the Armed Forces of Ukraine.
The danger from Transnistria has been discussed since the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, and the armed forces of Ukraine are prepared for possible provocations by the Russian contingent in Transnistria. And the publication of the plan serves as a preventive measure that deprives the enemy of the element of surprise.
There really is a Russian military contingent in Transnistria, as well as a pro-Russian population which Putin can use to create additional tension and to divert Ukrainian forces from other directions. Citizens should calmly perceive such information and take constructive actions, be more vigilant, prepare the local population for possible threats, and support the country's defensive readiness. Ivan Timoshka, Military Observer.
And specific regions, buffer zones, and possibly, so to speak, the seizure of Mykolaiev's DES, District Electrical Substations. In other words, all of this is, fantasies of the Russian Federation. They have voiced them repeatedly. Putin voiced them at the meeting of the Defense Ministry Board. That is, there are no reserves, no potential, and no systemic motivation. And he understands this himself.
The deputy head of the president's office, Palisa, explained that the Russians still plan to create a buffer zone in the Kharkiv, Sumy, and Chernihiv regions, as well as attempt to seize Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. In the long term, they aim to capture the Mykolaiv and Odessa regions.
Undoubtedly, their main focus this year will be on the Donbas, and if conditions are favorable for them, they will also expand and intensify their efforts in the southern direction. This includes the Alexandrovsk and all Zaporizhzhia directions. Pavel Palisa, Brigadier General of the Armed Forces of Ukraine.
Brigadier General Palisa also said that the occupiers are constantly changing their plans and deadlines for carrying them out, since they lack the forces and resources to fulfill them.
They announced these plans. Yes, they are supposedly preparing reserves to capture the Donetsk region, which, to be honest, have already been deployed dozens of times. We have repeatedly noted that there have been 23 deadlines for Pokrovsk. Since September 25th of last year, they have set the goal to capture Pokrovsk. This has not been achieved so far. Now, I'm not even talking about Donbas. let alone 5 regions of Ukraine. In other words, it's unrealistic.
Now, according to not only Ukrainian but also British intelligence, the armed forces of Ukraine have the best situation on the front in the past 10 months. Ukraine has an advantage in virtually all types of drones, and the number of Russian personnel being eliminated exceeds the replenished reserves. So there can be no talk of any buffer zone, especially in the Vinnytsia region.
An African trap for Putin? This is something the Kremlin did not expect. Ukraine is officially establishing itself in the Middle East and North Africa, delivering a crushing blow. Now, Ukrainian military bases will appear right under the noses of Russian mercenaries. Hunting the invisible, Ukraine begins clearing out Russia's shadow fleet, and this is just the beginning. See the details.
Ukraine is changing the rules of the game. The gates are open. First negotiations in Istanbul, then a trip to Damascus.
From once being a nation that primarily received international humanitarian aid, it is now steadily transforming into a country that actively provides and exports vital security assistance to others.
An alliance that will change the map of the world. And this is truly a major breakthrough for Ukrainian diplomacy. That's why the Kremlin has started to get seriously nervous.
This was not just Zelensky's initiative. There was interest in Ukraine in its defense technologies.
The alliance is based on shared interests, where both sides have a common adversary and a vision of what the region should look like without Putin's dominance. Ukraine is actively trying to establish itself both in the Middle East and in some African countries. First and foremost, in order to counter Russian influence and activity in various forms.
For a very long time, Syrian territory has been widely recognized as a critical strategic corridor for north-south-north transit routes involving Middle Eastern energy resources. Because of its unique position as a vital hub for international oil and gas pipelines, it is exceptionally beneficial for any global power to maintain a strong and friendly relationship with such a strategically positioned country.
For the first time since the early 2000s, Ukrainian authorities visited Syria. The delegation was accompanied by representatives from Turkey, and this is not just a diplomatic gesture, but part of a much more complex geopolitical game.
Against the backdrop of the global energy crisis, the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian president are interested in stable supplies of oil and petroleum products, which would allow for an effective solution to both the
needs of our country and accordingly the nature of material and technical support, primarily for the defense forces of Ukraine.
Damascus is getting rid of the Russian military presence in Syria and does not want to remain as dependent on Moscow as before.
Even with the recent and sudden change of the governing regime, the Russians have been fleeing from Syria in an incredible hurry, essentially running away as fast as they possibly can. But nevertheless, they are still desperately trying to negotiate terms regarding their strategic naval base in Tartus.
The elimination of Russian bases is only a matter of time.
In addition, after the change of Bashar Assad's regime, Syria is currently demonstrating its distance from the Russian Federation. In other words, we are talking about the elimination of the Russian Federation's military presence on the territory of this country.
Ukraine has declared its readiness to contribute to food security in the Middle East. This opens up new promising markets for Ukrainian companies.
A number of complex issues were being addressed regarding the expansion of our country's economic ties with several foreign partners, as well as, first and foremost, the possibility of expanding military technical cooperation with the countries of the Persian Gulf and Syria. The issue of scaling up Ukraine's successful experience in countering the enemy's aeroballistic strike capabilities was also being addressed.
Turkey needs Ukraine as a partner with real military experience and modern warfare technologies. In addition, Turkey has been competing with Moscow for many years in the Caucasus, the Middle East, and Central Asia. That is why Ukraine is gradually becoming integrated into Turkey's regional strategy.
Through the actions of the Ukrainian defense forces against the Russian Black Sea Fleet, well, in general, the Turks are watching this. Speaker One laughs with pleasure.
Ankara is seen as a key regional hub through which energy initiatives involving Ukraine can be implemented. Because now Turkey, like many other countries, is limiting its energy cooperation with Russia, including gas relations.
As I already mentioned, together with Turkey, we are containing Russian influence in this region. All the more so since there is already such experience, for example, in Libya, where once again Ukraine is cooperating with Turkey, helping the legitimate Libyan government, while Russia is fighting on the other side in the civil war that is ongoing in that country.
Libya is yet another country that is becoming a new external front in the war with Russia.
In this way, the Ukrainian side is expanding its ability to put pressure on the Russian Federation in terms of blockades and logistics. This concerns the possibility of ensuring a Russian military presence on the African continent and in the countries of the Near and Middle East. And first and foremost, it reduces the opportunities for Russia to earn windfall profits from the use of vessels belonging to the so-called shadow fleet.
Ukrainian military personnel are stationed at a base in Libya with access to the sea.
According to British intelligence, and specifically the Ukrainian intelligence community, namely the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine and the Special Operations Forces, have reduced the presence of the Russian Federation in the Black Sea Basin to a historic minimum. And apparently the successful experience of countering the Russian Federation in the Black Sea Basin will now be extrapolated directly to the Mediterranean basin as well.
In March, a strike was carried out on a Russian tanker flying the Russian flag. The vessel, which was carrying about 61,000 tons of liquefied natural gas, was seriously damaged. Ukraine is now not only striking at the Russian rear in the Black Sea, but also destroying the entire Russian export infrastructure.
The Ukrainian side has decided to push the Russian Federation out of the food and corresponding mineral fertilizer markets, both in Syria and in the countries of the Persian Gulf.
This is now not just a war for territory, but also for routes, insurance, sanctions, energy, and the right to determine where the front ends.
So first and foremost, this concerns the issues of Ukrainian security at the moment, of reducing the Russian Federation's ability to replenish both its treasury and accordingly to use the African continent as a base for its military political presence.
Experts note that most of the agreements reached are long-term in nature, and their practical implementation will depend on further diplomatic and economic efforts. Analyzing the support for Ukraine and its alliances with other countries, it can be said that the Kremlin is definitely not in a winning position right now.
Trump stopped a nuclear apocalypse. The US and Iran signed a secret pact. The Kremlin is in shock, and the world breathed a sigh of relief. But what is this? A victory or a cunning trap? What is really hidden in the secret protocols of this agreement? Watch.
There were only a few hours left before the disappearance of Iranian civilization.
And at that moment, the American President Donald Trump abruptly changes his rhetoric and, instead of the promised bombings, announces a pause.
Following extensive and detailed discussions with Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir of Pakistan, during which they personally requested that I immediately suspend the use of overwhelming and devastating military force that was scheduled to be employed tonight against Iran, and on the specific condition that the Islamic Republic of Iran formally agrees to the complete, full, immediate, and safe reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. I hereby agree to suspend all planned bombings and military attacks on Iran for a total period of 2 weeks. This will be a bilateral ceasefire.
2 weeks of silence in exchange for one of the key levers of the global economy, the Strait of Hormuz. Up to 20% of the world's oil and gas passes through it. In recent days, it has become the point where the interests of the US, Iran, and the entire Middle East converge.
It is impossible to open the Strait of Hormuz by military means. And as far as I can tell, Trump doesn't really have any other demands left for the Iranian side.
The Supreme National Security Council of Iran has confirmed the 2-week truce.
The enemy has suffered an undeniable, historic, and crushing defeat in its unjust, illegal, and criminal war against the Iranian nation.
Tehran immediately put forward 10 conditions, ranging from the complete lifting of sanctions to the unfreezing of assets and the de facto recognition of its nuclear program.
Since this is a cannibalistic regime, they're not that concerned about their own citizens. But their main goal is for this regime to survive. And they act in such a way to ensure the regime's survival. That's their only goal. And in pursuing this goal, they are quite consistent because that's why they pay no attention to any proposals for a temporary ceasefire. They want permanence, they want reparations, they want the regime to survive and continue to exist.
We received a 10-point proposal from Iran and consider it a workable basis for negotiations. Almost all the various points of past disputes have been agreed upon between the United States and Iran, but a 2-week period will allow the agreement to be finalized and completed.
And while the Middle East is trying to prevent a third world war, a political crisis is erupting within the United States itself. The actions of Donald Trump are raising more and more questions not only among allies but also within the country. Democratic Congresswoman Yasemin Ansari is calling for the application of the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, a mechanism for effectively removing the president from power, and at the same time is initiating impeachment proceedings against Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker states that something is wrong with the president, and California Governor Gavin Newsom is demanding that the cabinet begin the process of removing Donald Trump from office.
These discussions about the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, that the president is unable to fulfill his duties and therefore should be removed from office, let's just say, have become much louder. They were always there, but now they've gotten much louder. And it's not just the Democrats who are outraged and asking whether the Republicans finally have enough sense to remove this person from office. Now all the right-wing bloggers are involved in this as well. In other words, MAGA has split.
Conservative commentator Tucker Carlson, one of the most influential voices in the right-wing camp, is publicly attacking the head of the White House. The reason was a post by Trump published on Easter Sunday threatening strikes on Iran's civilian infrastructure. Carlson calls this a moral and military crime and essentially accuses the president of being ready to cross a dangerous line.
How dare you speak to your own country in such a disrespectful way, especially on this sacred Easter morning? Who do you think you are? You post a tweet with obscene language on Easter morning?
Amidst the mounting criticism directed at the 47th president, a wave of large-scale personnel changes begins in the White House. Following the resignations of Attorney General Pimondi and Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem, the administration is discussing new potential dismissals. Among the figures who may be affected by personnel decisions are U.S. Army Secretary Dan Drixel, FBI Director Kash Patel, and Labor Secretary Lori Chavez-Dermo.
Trump is reluctant to get rid of any of his top lieutenants, viewing dismissals as a concession to the Democrats and the media. Even in the last few months, an order was issued stating that no cabinet official would be dismissed before the midterm elections, although a series of firings was planned for Election Day. But the decline in support for the president since he started the war in Iran has changed the political calculus.
The war outside the United States is increasingly turning into a struggle for power within the country. On one side are the hawks ready to escalate, and on the other, the isolationists, who originally brought Trump to power with the promise not to drag Americans into new wars. And given the current situation, the question arises, will the 47th president be able to hold on, or will this split mark the beginning of the end of his political career?
The storm of the century. Putin and Kim's friendship is crumbling. The Iron Curtain has slammed shut on the Kremlin. Putin's plan to make North Korea a Russian vacation hub has failed disgracefully. The collapse of propaganda and the secret details of the failure. Watch.
The planes are flying, but there are still no passengers. The direct flights from Moscow to Pyongyang, launched in 2025 as an almost ideological tourism project, turned out in practice to be flights just for show.
The first foreigners allowed onto the new resort in 2025 were Russians. The first tour took place in mid-July and apparently was not very large.
For 2 days, we were the only ones there, absolutely. And then the locals arrived. And of course, it was very surprising when the entire resort was operating for just 13 to 15 people.
In just 6 months, there were 9 flights. As sources close to the airline admit, there were practically no tourists on board. When asked for clarification about the occupancy, the response was almost comical. Sometimes there are occupied seats.
A similar impression was left with Kommersant journalist Ispolin Lavrov. She describes deserted streets and what appear to be fake North Korean tourists.
The advantage here is that there are no tourists. For example, when you go to Thailand, it feels like all of Moscow is there, so to speak. Speaker one laughs.
At the same time, officially the flow to North Korea exists, almost 10,000 trips in 2025. But if you look closer, the picture becomes less impressive. About 1,000 are business visits and another roughly 5,000. They're tourists, but mostly organized groups who are brought in not through Moscow, but through Vladivostok on flights operated by the North Korean airline. and almost all of this flow is controlled by a single tour operator. So the direct bridge from Moscow, which was being counted on, turned out to be simply unnecessary, even though the expectations were completely different. The Russian authorities promoted North Korea as an alternative to closed Western destinations. The opening of air service was called a landmark event, and they assured that the flow of tourists would only increase. They even opened a new resort, once in Kalma, specifically aimed at Russians for this purpose.
You know, honestly, I still find it absolutely impossible to believe that I'm actually staying here at this incredibly high-end luxury beach resort, located right in the middle of North Korea. Can you imagine that? This is the very Wonsan Kalma resort that was personally opened by Kim Jong-un. Over there in the distance, the Koreans are shouting, and where it's empty, that's where the foreigners are. That boatman over there is watching us. I'm afraid he might blow his whistle or something.
Well, there wasn't much enthusiasm. 5,000 tourists a year. A figure that stands in stark contrast to the nearly 7 million Russians who, for example, chose Turkey. The reasons aren't just about the exotic nature of the destination. A trip to the DPRK is a strictly organized tour with no right to move around independently. Tourists are accompanied by guides. The itinerary is planned in advance. You can't deviate from it. In fact, it's not a vacation, but a carefully controlled route. And apparently the idea of spending a holiday under such conditions hasn't inspired everyone.
Sometimes it's annoying that the guides and Comrade Major are always whispering to each other. I constantly suspect that their paranoia is somehow because of me.
It's a rare occasion when you can just stand against the backdrop of a city in North Korea. Usually everyone is watching me sitting around.
Nevertheless, the project is not being shut down. In 2025, the government allocated more than 120 million rubles for air travel, tens of millions of which went to the operating airline. And even with almost zero passenger load, the flights are ready to continue if there is a government need. As a result, it turns out to be a paradox. There is a route, there are planes, there is money, but there is no demand.
Oh, did you hear that? Guys, we recorded the sound. I don't know what it is, a rocket launch or something else. Rumor has it there's a missile testing range nearby. But the guides aren't saying anything, they're keeping quiet like partisans. And it looks like what I was afraid of has happened here. As soon as we got just a few meters closer to the Korean beach, they started sending the children away. This man here is sending the children away so that we don't come into contact with them at all.
It seems that Russians didn't really appreciate the initiative, and instead of an exotic route from one isolation to another, they preferred much more familiar vacation options.
That's all for now. And for more hot news from the front, tune in to the next episode.